Natchez County, Mississippi, 1856. Sprawled across more than 1,000 acres along the Mississippi River was the Riverside Plantation, where cotton grew thick beneath the harsh southern sun. One of the most profitable properties in the region, it was also one of the most brutal. But on that August dawn, something was about to happen that no ledger would ever record, no letter would ever mention, and no newspaper would dare print. At 3:00 in the morning, Margaret Thornton, the plantation master's wife, left her bed for the 22nd night in a row. Her bare feet met the cold wooden floor of the master bedroom, and for a moment she held her breath, listening to her husband's heavy snoring beside her. Samuel Thornton slept like a man who believed himself untouchable, a man who owned 300 souls and answered to no one. From behind the wash basin, Margaret reached for the small oil lamp she had hidden there. Her hands trembled slightly as she lit it, the flame throwing dancing shadows across the walls, which were covered in expensive wallpaper brought over from England. Around her nightgown, she wrapped a dark shawl and picked up the cloth bundle she'd prepared hours before. Cornbread, dried meat, preserves, and whatever else she could sneak from the pantry without the cook noticing the next morning. As she moved toward the door, the floorboards creaked beneath her weight. She froze. Samuel stirred but didn't wake. Even in sleep, his face held that permanent look of cruel satisfaction that had become so familiar to her over their 7 years of marriage. Once she had loved that face, or at least believed she had. Now she could hardly look at it without feeling a deep, nauseating shame over what her life had become. Before we go on with this story, don't forget to drop a comment telling us which city you're listening from, and make sure to subscribe to the channel. Let's build up our community together. Thank you, and now back to the story. Down the grand staircase of the plantation house Margaret descended, a Greek Revival mansion that Samuel's father had built with money made from the bodies of enslaved people. Every marble step, every crystal chandelier, every imported piece of furniture stood for someone's suffering. She understood that now, though it had taken her years to see it clearly. Even at this hour, the August heat was suffocating. The air hung still and thick, carrying the smell of magnolia blossoms mixed with something darker, the stench of human misery that soaked every plantation across the deep South. In the darkness, crickets chirped. Somewhere in the distance, a hound barked once and then fell silent. Across the yard toward the slave quarters, Margaret made her way. After 3 weeks of midnight journeys, the path was now familiar. Like a ghost, she moved through the darkness, staying close to the shadows of the oak trees that lined the property. If any of the overseers caught her, they would report straight to Samuel, and she couldn't imagine what he would do. Actually, she could imagine it perfectly well, and that was what terrified her. In stark contrast to the main house stood the slave quarters. 20 rough wooden cabins arranged in 2 rows, each one cramming multiple families into spaces barely big enough for animals. No glass windows, only wooden shutters that offered little protection from the weather. The structures leaned at odd angles, their foundations sinking into the Mississippi mud. This was where the people who had built Samuel's fortune were forced to live. Margaret approached the cabin at the end of the 2nd row. This was where the children stayed, the ones whose parents had been sold away, or who had died from exhaustion, disease, or the lash. The plantation's orphans, though Samuel never used that word. He called them future assets, or developing inventory. Margaret had heard him say it at dinner parties, and the other planters had laughed. Softly, she tapped on the doorframe. A moment later, it opened just wide enough for a small face to peer out. It was Mary, maybe 8 years old, with wide eyes that had seen far too much for her age. "Miss Margaret," the girl whispered, her voice thin with hunger and hope. "I brought food," Margaret said quietly, slipping inside. The cabin's interior was even worse than she had remembered from her first visit. A dozen children, ranging from 4 to 12 years old, slept on the dirt floor with only thin blankets for comfort. The air inside was stifling, thick with the smell of unwashed bodies and sickness. Every single time Margaret entered this place, her heart broke. As she lit a small candle and began handing out the food, the children stirred. They moved like shadows themselves, silent, careful not to make a sound. They had learned that noise brought attention, and attention usually brought pain. "Thank you, Miss Margaret," whispered James, a 10-year-old boy with scars across his back from a whipping he'd received for dropping a basket of cotton. His eyes caught the candlelight as he took a piece of cornbread with both hands, as if it were made of gold. Margaret watched them eat, carefully rationing the small portions so that everyone got something. These children worked from dawn until dusk in the cotton fields, their small fingers perfect for the delicate work of harvesting. Samuel paid them nothing, fed them almost nothing, and worked them until they collapsed. Several had died since Margaret had come to Riverside. Their names were never spoken in the main house. "Miss Margaret," Mary said softly, tugging at her shawl. "Lucy's got the fever again. She's real hot." Margaret moved to where a small girl lay shivering despite the heat. Lucy couldn't have been more than 6 years old. When Margaret touched her forehead, it burned, and her breathing came in short, labored gasps. Margaret had seen this before. Malaria, pneumonia, or one of the other diseases that regularly swept through the slave quarters. Without proper medicine and care, Lucy would likely die within days. "I'll try to bring some willow bark tea tomorrow night," Margaret promised, knowing it was far too little, far too late. What Lucy really needed was a real doctor, real medicine, real rest. But in Samuel's world, enslaved children weren't entitled to such luxuries. As Margaret got ready to leave, she felt a presence near the door. She turned quickly, her heart racing, and saw a massive silhouette blocking the entrance. For a moment pure terror seized her. Had Samuel followed her? Had one of the overseers discovered her? But it was neither. The figure stepped slightly into the candlelight, revealing a man well over 6 feet tall, with shoulders as broad as a doorframe. This was Elias, one of the field workers. Margaret had seen him from a distance, but had never been this close to him before. The other enslaved people spoke of him in whispers, a man broken by the system, yet somehow still unbroken in spirit. "Miss," Elias said in a deep, quiet voice that carried decades of suffering, "you shouldn't be here. If the master finds out—" "I know," Margaret interrupted, her voice barely a whisper. "But I can't just let them starve, I can't." For a long moment Elias studied her. His eyes, despite the hardness life had carved into them, showed something that looked like understanding. Or maybe it was pity. Margaret couldn't tell. "You think you're helping," he said finally, "but you're just one person. This system, it's bigger than your kindness." "I know," Margaret repeated, and suddenly tears blurred her vision. "I know I can't change anything. I know these small gestures don't fix the horror of this place. But if I don't do something, even something small, I'll go mad. I'll become as monstrous as my husband." Elias nodded slowly. "I've been watching you for 3 weeks. I've seen you come here every night. I wanted to understand why a white woman from the master's house would risk everything for children that her world says aren't even human, because that's a lie," Margaret said fiercely, her voice rising slightly before she caught herself. "They are human, they are children, and what we're doing to them is evil. I may have been blind to it for years, but I see it now. I see it clearly. Seeing it and stopping it are different things." Elias said, "I know," Margaret said for the 3rd time, "but I have to try." Elias stepped aside to let her pass. But as she moved toward the door, he spoke again. "The master's a dangerous man, Miss Margaret. He's killed men for less than what you're doing. If he finds out, your white skin won't protect you like you think it will. I know." Margaret whispered one final time before slipping back into the darkness. To understand what happened at Riverside Plantation in August 1856, you must first understand the world that created it. The American South in the mid-19th century was built on a foundation of breathtaking cruelty disguised as economic necessity. Cotton was king, and enslaved people were the machinery that kept the kingdom running. Natchez, Mississippi, represented the pinnacle of this brutal system. By 1856, it was one of the wealthiest cities in America per capita, producing more millionaires than anywhere else in the nation. The source of this wealth was simple and monstrous. The enslaved people who worked the cotton fields generated enormous profits for the men who claimed ownership over their bodies and lives. Samuel Thornton was a second-generation plantation owner who had inherited Riverside from his father. Unlike his father, who had at least maintained some pretense of paternalistic care for the enslaved people under his control, Samuel ran his property with pure capitalist efficiency. Every decision was calculated to maximize profit. Enslaved people were worked to the absolute limit of human endurance, fed the minimum necessary to keep them alive, and punished severely for any infraction, real or imagined. The plantation operated on a simple but devastating logic. An enslaved person represented a capital investment that needed to generate returns. Children were future workers, adults were current workers, the elderly and infirm were liabilities to be disposed of as efficiently as possible. There was no room in this equation for humanity, compassion, or mercy. Samuel employed 3 overseers, brutal men who enforced his will with whips, chains, and psychological terror. The head overseer, a transplant from Virginia named Caleb Wright, had a reputation for creativity in his cruelty. He believed that fear was more effective than physical violence, though he certainly didn't shy away from the latter. Under his watch, Riverside became known throughout the county as a place where enslaved people were either broken completely or worked to death. Margaret had come to Riverside as a young bride of 19, the daughter of a moderately successful merchant from Vicksburg. Eager to elevate his family's social standing, her father had arranged the marriage to Samuel, who was 10 years older and infinitely wealthier. Margaret had been raised with all the prejudices and blind spots of her class and era. She had believed the lies she'd been told about slavery being a natural, even benevolent institution. But 7 years of living at Riverside had slowly eroded those comfortable delusions. She had seen things that couldn't be unseen. She had heard screams that couldn't be unheard. She had watched Samuel transform from the charming suitor of her youth into a monster whose casual brutality shocked even other plantation owners. The turning point had come 6 months earlier. Margaret had been walking through the grounds when she witnessed an overseer beating a young girl named Sarah for the crime of crying. Sarah's mother had been sold away just days before, shipped down river to New Orleans, never to be seen again. The child's grief was natural and heartbreaking, but on Riverside Plantation, even grief was considered insubordination. Margaret had wanted to intervene, but fear had frozen her in place. She watched as the overseer struck the child repeatedly while Samuel stood nearby, observing with calm satisfaction. When the beating was over, Samuel had turned to Margaret and smiled as if nothing unusual had occurred. That night, Margaret had locked herself in her room and sobbed until she vomited. The scales had fallen from her eyes, and she finally saw the truth. She was complicit in a system of unspeakable evil. Every meal she ate, every dress she wore, every comfort she enjoyed, all of it was purchased with the suffering of human beings whose only crime was being born with the wrong color skin in the wrong time and place. She couldn't free them. She had no legal power to do so, and Samuel would never agree to such a thing. She couldn't even openly oppose him without risking her own safety, but she could do something small. She could make sure the most vulnerable among the enslaved, the children, didn't starve to death in the night. And so the secret midnight journeys had begun. For 3 weeks, Margaret had been stealing food from her own pantry and smuggling it to the children's cabin. It was such a small act of resistance in the face of such overwhelming injustice, but it was all she could do. On the 23rd night of her secret missions, Margaret made a crucial mistake. She stayed too long in the children's cabin. Lucy's fever had worsened, and Margaret had spent extra time trying to cool the child's forehead with damp cloths while whispering prayers she no longer believed a just God would hear. By the time she left the cabin, The first hints of dawn were beginning to lighten the eastern sky. Quickly she moved across the yard, her heart pounding as she realized how close she was cutting it. The plantation would wake soon. Workers would begin emerging from their cabins. Overseers would start their morning rounds. Margaret was 50 yards from the main house when she heard it. The unmistakable sound of the master bedroom window slamming shut. She looked up and her blood turned to ice. Samuel stood in the window, still in his nightshirt, staring directly at her with an expression she'd never seen before. Not anger, not even surprise, something darker and more calculated. He had been watching her, waiting. Planning? Margaret ran the remaining distance to the house and burst through the back door into the kitchen. The cook, an older enslaved woman named Bessie, looked up in shock. "Miss Margaret, what? Not now, Bessie," Margaret gasped, rushing past her toward the stairs. But she didn't make it. Samuel was already descending, moving with deliberate slowness. He had dressed hastily, pulling on trousers and a shirt but leaving his feet bare. In his right hand he carried his riding crop, the same one he used on his horses, and occasionally on enslaved people who displeased him. "Margaret," he said softly, and that softness was more terrifying than any shout could have been. "I've been watching you for a week now. I've been waking up in the night and watching you sneak out to the slave quarters. I wanted to see how long you'd continue this little charity project of yours." Margaret backed against the wall. "Samuel, I can explain." "Explain." Samuel's voice remained quiet, controlled. "Oh, I think I understand perfectly. My wife, the mistress of Riverside Plantation, has been stealing from my pantry to feed my property, not just feeding them, but potentially encouraging thought above their station, making them think they deserve kindness, deserve consideration, deserve anything other than the work I require of them. Their children," Margaret said, finding a thread of courage in her terror. "Starving children. They are not children." Samuel interrupted, his voice hardening. "They are future field workers, assets, investments, and you've been undermining my authority and my management of this property." He moved closer, the riding crop tapping against his leg in a rhythmic pattern. Margaret had seen him do this before, right before he hurt someone. It was a warning sign that violence was imminent. "I should have seen it earlier," Samuel continued, speaking more to himself than to her. "You've been growing soft, questioning me, looking at me with those judgmental eyes at dinner when I discuss business with the other planters. I thought it was just womanly emotion, something you overcome, but now I see it's worse. You've developed sympathy for them." He said the word sympathy like it was a disease. "Samuel, please, you've embarrassed me," he said, and now anger was finally creeping into his voice. "Do you understand that, if the other planters found out that my own wife was acting like some northern abolitionist, sneaking around feeding slaves like they were pets, I'd be a laughingstock? My business relationships would suffer, my reputation would be destroyed." "I'm sorry," Margaret whispered, though she wasn't sure what she was apologizing for. "For getting caught, for caring, for being married to a monster. Sorry isn't sufficient," Samuel said. He raised the riding crop slightly. "You need to understand the consequences of defying me. You need to learn your place in this household, just like the slaves need to learn theirs." Margaret closed her eyes, bracing for the blow. She heard the crop whistle through the air, but the impact never came. Instead, she heard a crash, the sound of splintering wood, and Samuel's sudden sharp cry of pain and surprise. Margaret opened her eyes to see something that seemed impossible. Samuel was on the ground, the riding crop skittering across the floor, and standing over him was Elias. The enslaved man had somehow entered the house, probably through the back door that Margaret had left open in her panic. He must have followed her, seen the confrontation, and made a split-second decision that would change everything. "Don't you touch her," Elias said, his deep voice filling the room like thunder. Samuel scrambled backward, genuine fear flashing across his face for perhaps the first time in his adult life. "Do you know what you've done? Do you understand what happens to slaves who raise their hand against a white man, against their master?" "I understand," Elias said calmly. "I understand everything." And in that moment, Margaret realized something profound was happening. This wasn't just about protecting her. This wasn't even primarily about her. This was about every beating Elias had endured, every humiliation he'd suffered, every moment of his stolen life. This was about a system so evil that it could only survive by breaking the human spirit, and here was a spirit that refused to be broken. Samuel found his voice, that commanding tone he used to exert control. "Elias, you will step back immediately, or I will have you whipped until there's no skin left on your back. Then I'll sell your wife and daughters so far south you'll never see them again." Elias flinched at the mention of his family. Margaret hadn't even known he had a family, but he didn't move. "You were going to hit Miss Margaret," he said. "I've watched you hit many people, Master. I've been hit by you, but I wasn't going to stand there and watch you hurt the only person in this house who's shown us any humanity." The standoff lasted only seconds, but it felt like hours. Margaret could hear Bessie in the kitchen, probably terrified and uncertain what to do. The house was beginning to wake up. Soon others would arrive, and when they did, Elias would be killed. That was certain. The law was clear. An enslaved person who struck a white person, let alone their master, would be executed. "Elias," Margaret said urgently, "you need to run right now. Get your family and run. I'll tell them you overpowered me, that I couldn't stop you. Just go before." But it was already too late. The front door burst open, and Caleb Wright, the head overseer, stormed in with 2 of his men. They must have been making their morning rounds and heard the commotion. "What the hell?" Caleb took in the scene immediately. The master on the ground, the slave standing over him, the mistress pressed against the wall. His face contorted with rage. "You've just killed yourself, boy." Caleb pulled a pistol from his belt. Elias didn't run. He stood his ground, and Margaret saw something in his expression that broke her heart. It was acceptance. He had known this would happen. He had made his choice anyway. No. Margaret threw herself between Caleb and Elias. "Don't shoot him." "Get out of the way, ma'am," Caleb growled. "I said don't shoot him." Margaret's voice carried an authority she didn't know she possessed. "He was protecting me from an intruder. There was someone else here. Someone who ran out the back." Elias stopped him. "He's a hero, not a criminal." Samuel, who had regained his feet, stared at his wife in disbelief. "Margaret, what are you?" "There was an intruder." Margaret repeated firmly, looking directly into her husband's eyes. "Someone who broke in, probably to rob us. Elias happened to be nearby and came to help. He saved us both. That's what happened. That's the only story anyone will tell." The room fell silent. Samuel understood exactly what his wife was doing, creating a fiction that would save the slave's life while also providing cover for her own nocturnal activities. If they investigated the intruder story, her visits to the slave quarters would be revealed. But if they accepted the lie, everyone could move forward. It was blackmail wrapped in a fabrication, delivered by a woman who had finally found the courage to use the only power she possessed in this brutal world. Samuel's face cycled through several expressions: rage, disbelief, calculation, and finally a cold acceptance. He looked at Elias, then at his wife, then at the overseer. "Miss Margaret is correct," Samuel said stiffly. "There was an intruder." Elias here showed unexpected initiative in defending this household. Everyone will remember the story that way. Caleb looked like he wanted to argue but knew better than to question the master in front of others. He holstered his pistol with obvious reluctance. "If you say so, sir." "I do say so," Samuel replied. "Now get back to your rounds, and Elias, get back to the quarters." Elias moved toward the door, but before leaving he turned to look at Margaret. Their eyes met for just a moment, and in that instant 1,000 unspoken words passed between them. Gratitude, understanding, recognition of shared humanity in a world designed to deny it. Then he was gone, disappearing into the dawn light. The days following that confrontation were tense and strange at Riverside Plantation. Samuel said nothing more about Margaret's midnight activities, but she knew their marriage had fundamentally changed. He watched her now with a mixture of suspicion and something that might have been grudging respect. She had proven herself capable of defiance, of protecting others at risk to herself, and Samuel didn't know quite how to handle this new version of his wife. Margaret continued her visits to the children's cabin, but now she was more careful. She varied her times, took different routes, and always made sure to be back before Samuel might wake. Surprisingly, he never interfered. It was as if they had reached an unspoken agreement. He would tolerate her small acts of mercy as long as she didn't challenge his authority in any other way. But the real change at Riverside wasn't between husband and wife. It was among the enslaved population. Word of what Elias had done spread through the quarters like wildfire. The man who had stood up to the master. The man who had protected a white woman who showed them kindness. The man who had faced down death without flinching. It wasn't rebellion, not in any organized sense, but it was something perhaps more powerful. A reminder that the human spirit could not be completely crushed, no matter how brutal the system. Elias himself tried to avoid attention, but it was impossible. The other enslaved people looked at him differently now. The children whispered his name like he was a character from the stories the elders told about African warriors and freedom. Even the overseers treated him with a wary caution they hadn't shown before. Margaret found opportunities to speak with him occasionally, always briefly and carefully. She learned that his wife Ruth worked in the laundry, and their daughter Grace was 7 years old and worked in the fields alongside the other children. He had been born enslaved in Virginia and sold to Mississippi when he was 16. He had lived at Riverside for 12 years, enduring things that would have broken most people. "Why did you do it?" Margaret asked him one evening when she encountered him near the well. "You knew what could happen. You have a family. Why risk everything for me?" Elias was quiet for a long moment, drawing water from the well. "Miss Margaret, I didn't do it just for you. I did it because for the first time in my life, I saw someone from the master's house actually see us as human. You're trying to keep those children alive, that matters, and when I saw him about to hurt you for showing us kindness, I couldn't let that stand. Some things are worth the risk. But you could have died." "Ma'am, we're dying every day here, slowly, piece by piece. Sometimes standing up is the only way to prove you're still alive." His words haunted Margaret. She had thought of her midnight missions as small acts of kindness, almost embarrassingly insufficient in the face of the system's enormity. But to the people she was helping, they represented something more. Proof that not everyone was lost to the casual cruelty that defined plantation life. Lucy, the little girl with the fever, recovered slowly. Margaret had managed to bring better medicine and spent extra time caring for her. Watching the child's strength return felt like a small victory against the vast machinery of injustice. It didn't fix anything, didn't change the fundamental evil of slavery, but it saved one life, and in that moment one life felt like everything. Samuel Thornton was not a man who forgot slights or forgave defiance. Though he had accepted the fiction about the intruder and allowed Margaret to continue her activities, he was planning his response. His wife had checkmated him in front of the overseers, had forced him into a position where he had to choose between his pride and his reputation. He had chosen reputation, but the pride was wounded, and wounded pride in men like Samuel was dangerous. 3 weeks after the confrontation, Samuel hosted a dinner party for several neighboring planters. It was a typical affair for the class and era: excessive food, expensive wine, cigars, and conversation about cotton prices, politics, and the peculiar institution that made their lifestyle possible. Margaret attended as required, playing the role of beautiful hostess while internally recoiling from the casual racism and breathtaking hypocrisy of the guests. She smiled and served and pretended not to hear when the men discussed breeding strategies for enslaved people like they were livestock. But during dessert, Samuel made a comment that chilled her blood. "Gentlemen, I've been considering a change in management strategy here at Riverside," he said, swirling brandy in a crystal glass. "I'm thinking of selling off some of the less productive workers, particularly the young ones who aren't yet capable of full field work. They consume resources without generating sufficient returns. Better to sell them down river while they still have value and replace them with prime field hands in their productive years. Margaret's fork clattered against her plate. Every person at the table turned to look at her. "Samuel," she said carefully, "those children will become productive workers in a few years. Surely it makes more financial sense to keep them." "On the contrary, my dear," Samuel replied with a cold smile. "The investment required to maintain them until they reach working age exceeds the return. It's simple economics." Margaret understood immediately this was retaliation. Samuel was going to sell the children she'd been feeding, the ones she'd tried to save. He would separate them from their families, ship them to the brutal sugar plantations of Louisiana, where their life expectancy would be measured in years, not decades. And he would do it while cloaking it in the language of business and efficiency. "I think that's brilliant, Thornton," one of the other planters said. "I've been considering something similar. The young ones require such oversight." "Indeed," Samuel agreed. "I plan to contact the traders in Natchez next week. Should be able to move a dozen or so." Margaret excused herself from the table, claiming a headache. In her room, she paced frantically, trying to think of some way to stop what was about to happen. But she was trapped by the same forces that trapped everyone on the plantation. The law gave Samuel absolute authority over the enslaved people. She had no power to prevent him from selling them, unless she did something desperate, something that would change everything forever. An idea formed, dangerous and impossible. She would need help. She would need someone brave enough to defy not just Samuel, but the entire social order. She would need Elias. Meeting with Elias alone was risky, but Margaret had learned how to move through the plantation unseen. She found him after dark, repairing a fence near the eastern boundary of the property. "I need your help," she said without preamble. "Samuel is planning to sell the children, a dozen of them, maybe more. He's doing it to punish me, but they're the ones who will suffer for it." Elias's jaw tightened. "When, within the week, traders are coming from Natchez? What can we do, Miss Margaret? You don't have the power to stop this, and I'm property myself. We can't. We can run." Margaret interrupted. "All of us, you, your family, the children, anyone who wants to try. I can get supplies, money from Samuel's safe. I know routes through the swamps. It's dangerous, probably impossible, but it's better than letting those children be sold to the sugar plantations." Elias stared at her like she'd lost her mind. "You're talking about helping slaves escape. You understand what happens to people who do that. White people who help runaways are arrested, imprisoned, destroyed financially. And that's if they are lucky. Sometimes they're killed, I know. And even if we make it north, which is unlikely, you'd be giving up everything. Your home, your safety, your entire life." "I know," Margaret repeated. "But I can't live with myself if I don't try. These past weeks helping those children, talking with you and the others, I felt more human than I have in years. This plantation, this life, it's a beautiful lie built on unspeakable suffering. I'd rather risk everything trying to do something right than spend one more day maintaining the lie." Elias was quiet for a long time. "You understand most of us won't survive the journey, the patrols, the slave catchers, the swamps, the river. Even if we make it to free territory, they hunt runaways for years. I understand, but I also understand that some of those children will definitely die if they're sold down river. At least this way they have a chance. What about your husband?" Margaret's expression hardened. "Samuel made his choice when he decided to sell children for revenge. I'm making mine." Elias studied her face in the moonlight, searching for any hesitation or doubt. Finally he nodded. "I'll talk to the others, see who's willing to risk it. But Miss Margaret, once we start this, there's no going back for any of us." "I know," Margaret said. "But sometimes moving forward is the only choice worth making." 3 days later, everything was ready. Margaret had stolen money from Samuel's safe, nearly $300, enough to buy supplies and possibly bribe anyone they encountered. She had gathered food, blankets, and medicine. She had studied maps of the Underground Railroad routes, though getting to the first safe house would require traveling nearly 100 miles through hostile territory. 15 people would make the attempt: Elias, his wife Ruth, and daughter Grace, the 12 children from the cabin Margaret had been visiting, and Margaret herself. Others had wanted to join, but Elias had wisely limited the group to those who would likely be sold anyway. A smaller group moved faster and attracted less attention. They chose a moonless night, using the darkness as cover. The plan was simple but dangerous. Move through the swamps toward Vicksburg, then follow the river north while staying off the main roads. If they could reach the first underground railroad station, a Quaker farm about 90 miles north, they would have a chance. Margaret left a note for Samuel. She didn't try to explain or justify. She simply wrote, "I couldn't live the lie anymore. Don't look for us." She knew he would look anyway, would send slave catchers and lawmen after them. But perhaps the note would buy them a few hours' head start. At midnight, the group assembled near the eastern boundary of the plantation. The children were frightened but silent, understanding that noise meant capture. Ruth carried a small bag of belongings, though they'd been warned to travel light. Elias carried a knife, not much of a weapon, but better than nothing. Margaret took one last look at Riverside Plantation, the mansion glowing faintly in the darkness. Part of her mourned the loss of safety and comfort, but a larger part felt a profound relief, like she was finally shedding a skin that had never quite fit. "Ready?" Elias asked quietly. "Ready," Margaret confirmed. They disappeared into the darkness, 15 souls risking everything for the slim possibility of freedom. Samuel discovered them missing at dawn. His rage was apocalyptic. He immediately sent riders to alert the county sheriff, the slave patrol, and every neighbor within 20 miles. He offered a substantial reward for their capture. $500 for Elias, alive or dead, and $200 for Margaret, alive only. The slave catchers arrived by mid-morning, brutal men with dogs bred specifically to hunt human beings. They picked up the trail quickly, following it into the swamp southeast of the plantation. But Margaret had been clever. She had deliberately led them southeast before doubling back northwest. The trick bought them several hours as the catchers wasted time following the false trail. The fugitives moved through the swamps with Elias leading. He knew these lands better than Margaret, having worked them for years. He guided them through waterways that hid their scent from the dogs and along paths that avoided the main patrol routes. The journey was brutal. The August heat was oppressive, and the swamps were full of dangers: snakes, alligators, stagnant water that carried disease. The children struggled, their small legs not built for the punishing pace, but they pushed forward, driven by the knowledge that capture meant death or something worse. On the second night, they heard the dogs in the distance. The catchers had found their real trail. "We need to split up," Elias said urgently. "I'll lead some of the older children south, create a false trail. You take the youngest ones north. We'll meet at the river crossing near Vicksburg if we can." "No," Margaret protested. "We stay together. If we stay together, they'll catch all of us. This way, some of us might make it. That's what matters." Ruth grabbed her husband's hand. "I'm going with you. You need to stay with Grace. Grace can run faster than I can. She'll be safer with Miss Margaret. You know that's true." The decision was made quickly because they had no time. Elias took 6 of the older children and headed south, making as much noise as they dared to draw the pursuers. Margaret, Ruth, Grace, and 6 younger children continued north, moving as silently as ghosts through the darkness. The sound of the dogs grew louder behind them, then gradually faded to the south. Elias's gambit was working, but Margaret felt sick knowing what might happen to him if he was caught. 3 days later, Margaret and her group reached the Mississippi River, near a small settlement north of Vicksburg. They were exhausted, hungry, and nearly out of supplies. 2 of the children had developed fevers. Ruth had an infected cut on her leg that was getting worse. They couldn't go much further without rest and help. Margaret used some of her money to buy passage on a small ferry that transported goods across the river. She posed as a widow traveling north with her servants, a common enough sight that the ferrymen didn't ask too many questions. The crossing was tense. At any moment they might be recognized or stopped by patrols, but they made it to the western bank without incident. That night they took shelter in an abandoned barn. Margaret was tending to one of the sick children when she heard horses approaching. Her heart sank. Had they been found? But it wasn't slave catchers. It was Elias. He looked terrible, covered in mud and blood, limping badly and clearly exhausted. But he was alive, and he wasn't alone. 3 of the 6 children who had gone with him were still there. The others, Margaret didn't ask. She saw the answer in Elias's eyes. "The dogs caught up with us near Natchez," he said quietly. "We had to split up again. 3 of the kids headed east toward Alabama. I don't know if they made it. Thomas, Sarah, and Michael stayed with me. We circled back, lost the dogs in the river." "You're hurt," Margaret said, looking at the gash on his leg and the cuts across his arms. "I'll live. Have you found the safe house?" "Not yet. I have an address, but I'm not sure how to find it without drawing attention." "We'll figure it out," Elias said. "We've come this far." It took another 2 days of cautious travel, but they finally found it. A modest farm outside a small town, marked by the specific arrangement of quilts on the clothesline that the Underground Railroad used as a signal. Margaret approached the house with her heart pounding, knowing that if she'd been wrong, if this wasn't actually a safe station, they were all doomed. An older white couple answered the door. The man studied Margaret's face, then glanced past her to where the others waited in the trees. "A friend of a friend sent us," Margaret said, using the code phrase she'd been told. The man's stern expression softened slightly. "There's a storm coming. You should take shelter." It was the correct response. They were at a safe house. The couple, John and Mary Patterson, Quakers who had been helping runaways for a decade, brought them inside. They provided food, medicine, and a place to sleep. More importantly, they provided information about the next leg of the journey. "You'll need to travel another 100 miles north before you're truly safe," John explained, showing them a map. "We have contacts in stations along the way, but I'll be honest with you. You're being hunted heavily. The reward for your capture is substantial, and your faces are being circulated throughout the region. It's going to be dangerous. Everything about this has been dangerous," Margaret said, "but we didn't come this far to turn back now." Mary Patterson looked at her with a mixture of admiration and concern. "You understand you can never go back, don't you? Even if you make it to free territory, you'll be a fugitive. Your husband will never stop looking for you." "I know," Margaret said. "But I'd rather be a fugitive fighting for something right than a lady living a comfortable lie." The next 3 weeks were the hardest of Margaret's life. They moved from safe house to safe house, always just ahead of the slave catchers Samuel had hired. Every day brought new dangers, near encounters with patrols, sickness among the children, dwindling supplies, and the constant fear that their next step would be their last. They lost one more child to fever, a boy named Samuel, cruelly named after his former master. Margaret held him as he died, whispering promises that she knew were lies, that he would be all right, that they were almost to freedom, that his suffering had meaning. But they also found unexpected allies, free black communities that provided shelter and guidance, white abolitionists who risked everything to help them, even some sympathetic whites in border areas who didn't support slavery but were too afraid to openly defy it. Elias and Margaret formed an unlikely partnership, combining her knowledge and resources with his strength and survival skills. The barriers of race and class that had defined their relationship at Riverside dissolved in the shared struggle for freedom. They were simply 2 people trying to keep children alive in a world that wanted them dead or enslaved. Ruth, despite her infected leg, proved to be the emotional backbone of the group, keeping spirits up even when everything seemed hopeless. Grace, at 7 years old, showed courage that shamed many adults. The other children clung together, forming bonds of survival that would last their entire lives. Finally, in October 1856, they crossed into free territory. It wasn't dramatic, just a river crossing into a state where slavery was illegal. But the moment their feet touched that northern bank, something fundamental changed. They were no longer enslaved. They were no longer property. They were, for the first time in most of their lives, legally human. Freedom, they quickly discovered, was more complicated than they'd imagined. Free didn't mean equal, free didn't mean safe, free didn't mean welcomed. Margaret never saw Samuel again. But she learned through letters from sympathetic contacts in Mississippi that he had become consumed by his hatred for her. He spent thousands of dollars on slave catchers, offered enormous rewards, and wrote letters to authorities throughout the North demanding her arrest for theft and aiding fugitives. But the Underground Railroad network protected her identity, and she eventually made her way to Canada, where she was truly beyond his reach. The children were placed with abolitionist families who could provide for them. Some thrived, others struggled with the trauma of their early years. All of them lived free. Elias, Ruth, and Grace settled in a small black community in Ontario. Elias became a speaker for the abolitionist movement, telling his story at churches and town halls throughout Canada and the northern United States. His testimony was powerful precisely because it was understated. He simply described what life had been like at Riverside Plantation, and the horror of truth needed no embellishment. Margaret never remarried. She lived modestly, working as a teacher and supporting abolitionist causes. She wrote letters to newspapers describing what she had witnessed in the South, adding her voice to the growing chorus demanding an end to slavery. When the Civil War finally came in 1861, she felt a bitter satisfaction knowing that the system she had fled was beginning to tear itself apart. She stayed in contact with Elias and his family. They met occasionally, this unlikely alliance of a former plantation mistress and a formerly enslaved man. They didn't speak much about the past. It was too painful. But they understood each other in ways few people could. In her later years, Margaret reflected on those nights at Riverside when she had snuck food to starving children. Those small acts of kindness hadn't ended slavery. They hadn't reformed the system. They hadn't even saved everyone she'd tried to help. But they had mattered. They had kept specific children alive long enough to eventually find freedom. They had sparked a chain of events that transformed lives. Do you think it was worth it? Grace asked her once, decades later, when Grace was a grown woman with children of her own. Everything you gave up, everything you risked. Margaret thought about the question carefully. She had lost her home, her wealth, her social standing, and her safety. She had spent years looking over her shoulder, fearing that Samuel's vengeance would catch up with her. She had never known the comfort and security that her upbringing had promised her. Every single day, Margaret finally answered, "I lost things that seemed important, but I found something more valuable, my humanity. I spent the first part of my life blind to the suffering around me, complicit in a system of evil. I spent the second part of my life trying to fight it. Given those choices, I'd make the same one every time." Grace smiled. "My father says the same thing. He says the night he stood up to your husband was the first time he truly felt like a man. Not property worth everything that came after." Margaret nodded. "Your father is the bravest person I've ever known. He had everything to lose, and he stood up anyway. That's true courage." They sat in comfortable silence for a while. Two people connected by a history of shared struggle and survival. Outside, Grace's children played in the yard. Free children, born into a world where they would never know the chains their grandmother had worn. The story of Riverside Plantation became one of those legends whispered in abolitionist circles. The wife who chose justice over comfort, the enslaved man who stood up to his master, the children who survived against impossible odds. It was a story of both horror and hope, of evil confronted and partially overcome. But it was also a reminder that good intentions weren't enough. Margaret's small acts of kindness had helped, but they hadn't reformed the system. Only the larger forces of history, the Civil War, emancipation, and the long struggle for civil rights that would continue for another century, could do that. Still, Margaret never regretted her choice. She had seen true evil and decided she couldn't be part of it anymore. She had risked everything for people the world told her didn't matter. She had found her humanity in the process of recognizing the humanity of others. And in the end, perhaps that was the real lesson. that systems of oppression survive not through the active cruelty of monsters, but through the passive complicity of ordinary people. They survive when good people see suffering and do nothing, when they make excuses, when they accept the comfortable lies. Margaret Thornton had stopped accepting the lies. She had stopped doing nothing. And while she hadn't saved everyone or fixed everything, she had saved some. She had done something. In the grand arc of history, perhaps that was enough.